7 military dogs broke formation at the exact same moment and ran straight across a fairground parking lot toward an old farmer. Nobody had noticed all morning. Handlers shouted every command they knew. The dogs ignored every single one of them. Within seconds, all 7 German shepherds had surrounded the old man, sitting in a tight circle around his folding lawn chair, refusing to move, refusing to bark, refusing to do anything except stare at him with an intensity that made grown soldiers go quiet. And when one of the canine handlers knelt down to gently pull her dog away, the animal turned and pressed something into her open hand instead. A dog tag. Old, scratched, the chain long since broken, the kind of dog tag that should have been buried in a drawer somewhere, not carried in the mouth of a working military dog at a county fair in rural Tennessee. The handler turned it over in her fingers, read the name stamped into the metal, and went completely pale, because that name did not belong to anyone she had ever met. It belonged to a soldier whose unit had vanished from military record almost entirely, a mission so quietly buried that even her own commanding officer, standing 20 feet away, had never once heard it mentioned. The old farmer sat motionless in his lawn chair, surrounded by 7 dogs he had never trained, never met, and never given a single command to. His hands trembled in his lap, his eyes pale blue and suddenly glassy, fixed on that small piece of scratched metal like he was looking at a ghost. "Sir," the handler said carefully, holding the tag out toward him, "do you know what this is?" The old man didn't answer right away. He simply reached out one weathered hand, took the dog tag gently from her palm, and pressed it against his chest, like he was afraid it might disappear if he let it go. "I do," he finally whispered. "I just never thought I'd see it again." Nobody in that parking lot understood what they were witnessing. Not the handler, not the crowd of fairgoers who had stopped to watch. Not even the commanding officer, who would within the hour make a phone call that would change everything anyone thought they knew about a quiet farmer named Earl Hutchins. But to understand why 7 trained military dogs abandoned every order they had ever learned just to surround one old man in a lawn chair, we have to go back. Back to a small farmhouse outside a town most people have never heard of. Back to a man the whole county thought they knew. And back to a secret Earl Hutchins had buried so deep, even his own family didn't know the whole truth. Earl Hutchins had lived on the same patch of land outside Millbrook, Tennessee, for nearly 50 years. His farmhouse sat at the end of a long gravel road, paint peeling from the porch railings, a tin roof that rattled every time the wind picked up. He grew soybeans on 40 acres that had belonged to his father before him and his grandfather before that, and he did it the same simple way every single year, rising before the sun, working until his back ached, and falling asleep most nights in the same worn recliner where he'd read his Bible for as long as anyone in Millbrook could remember. Folks in town knew Earl the way small towns know everybody, but they didn't know much about him. He came into Pruitt's Hardware once a week for supplies, paid in cash, and rarely said more than a polite nod and a morning to whoever stood behind the counter. He attended the Baptist Church on County Road 9 every Sunday, sat in the same pew near the back, and left before the social hour started every single week, without exception. If you asked anyone in Millbrook to describe Earl Hutchins, you'd hear the same handful of words. Quiet, private, a little strange maybe, but harmless. He had no wife that anyone remembered, no children visiting on holidays, no stories told about him at the diner, the way stories got told about everybody else in a town that small. He was simply there, the way an old fence post is there, weathered and unremarkable, easy to walk past without a second glance. What nobody in Millbrook knew was that Earl rose every morning at 4, not because the soybeans demanded it, but because his body had never unlearned the habit. What nobody knew was that he checked every window latch in his house twice before bed, every single night, the same way he had checked them for 50 years. What nobody knew was that sometimes, on quiet summer nights when the cicadas grew loud enough to drown out the world, Earl would sit alone on his porch steps and weep softly for men whose names he had never spoken out loud to a single living soul. He had a small metal box hidden beneath the floorboards of his bedroom closet, the kind of hiding place a man only builds when he has something he needs nobody to ever find. Inside that box were three things: a faded photograph of young men in desert fatigues, sunburned and grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders, a folded American flag, the kind given to families at military funerals, its creases sharp even after decades of being kept exactly the same way, and a single dog tag, the chain broken, the same one that would eventually end up pressed into a stranger's palm at a county fair decades later. Earl never opened that box in front of anyone. He had built his entire quiet life around making sure nobody ever asked the questions that box could answer, and for nearly 50 years, his plan had worked perfectly. Until the day the county fair organizers decided to bring in a military canine demonstration team, and Earl Hutchins made the mistake of simply wanting, for once in his long and solitary life, to watch something that reminded him of who he used to be. The Millbrook County Fair had been a late summer tradition for as long as anyone could remember: 3 days of carnival rides, homemade pie contests, and tractor pulls, drawing crowds from 4 surrounding counties. This particular year, the fair committee had arranged something new: a demonstration from a regional canine unit stationed nearly 2 hours away, meant to showcase the training and discipline of military working dogs as part of a broader community outreach effort honoring veterans. Captain Lisa Render, a sharp, no-nonsense officer who had spent 11 years working alongside military dogs, arrived early that morning with her team of 7 handlers and 7 German shepherds, each one a model of discipline, trained for explosive detection and patrol work, each one capable of executing complex commands without hesitation. The demonstration drew a respectable crowd near the livestock pavilion. Families settling onto bleachers, children pressing close to the rope line for a better look at the dogs. Captain Render walked her team through a series of obedience routines, drawing appreciative applause as the dogs executed precise formations, weaving and heeling and sitting in perfect synchronized rows. Near the back of the crowd, almost entirely unnoticed, sat Earl Hutchins in a folding lawn chair he had brought from home, exactly the way he had quietly settled into the back pew of his church for 50 years. He wore his usual faded overalls, and a ball cap pulled low over his eyes, watching the dogs with an expression nobody around him bothered to notice. An expression that, had anyone actually looked closely, carried far more weight than simple curiosity. A few rows ahead of him sat a cluster of local men, regulars at the diner, who fancied themselves the unofficial town council of opinions on everything from weather to politics. One of them, a heavyset man named Roy Calhoun, who ran the feed store, glanced back and spotted Earl sitting alone. "Look at old Hutchins," Roy said to his buddies, not bothering to lower his voice much. "Bet he's never seen a dog that wasn't chasing his chickens." A round of chuckles passed through the group. One of the younger men leaned toward Roy. "Heard he won't even let the mailman past his gate. Crazy old hermit, if you ask me." "Probably scared of his own shadow," Roy added, grinning. "Man spent so long alone on that farm. Wouldn't surprise me if he forgot how to talk to people altogether." The words drifted back through the crowd, and a few nearby fairgoers laughed along. The way people laugh at someone they've decided, without ever actually knowing, isn't worth taking seriously. Earl heard every word. He always heard everything. A habit from a life he had buried so deep most days he could almost convince himself it belonged to someone else entirely. But he said nothing. He simply adjusted his cap, folded his weathered hands in his lap, and kept his eyes on the dogs. Captain Render, unaware of the quiet mockery rippling through her audience, continued the demonstration, walking her 7 dogs through a final formation exercise meant to close out the show. The dogs lined up in perfect rows, tails still, ears forward, awaiting her next command. That was the exact moment everything changed. Without any signal, without any command, all 7 German shepherds turned their heads in unison toward the back of the crowd, their bodies going rigid, ears snapping forward with an intensity that silenced the chatter around them instantly. Captain Render felt it before she fully registered it, the sudden shift in her dog's posture, the kind of synchronized alertness she had only ever seen during live threat detection. Her hand instinctively moved toward her radio. "Eyes up," she called to her handlers. Something's got their attention. Then, before anyone could issue a single restraining command, all 7 dogs broke formation at once and sprinted directly toward the back of the crowd, weaving through startled fairgoers, ignoring every shouted command from their handlers, moving with a single shared purpose that left every trained professional on that field utterly speechless. They didn't stop until they reached Earl Hutchins. The 7 dogs surrounded his lawn chair in a tight, deliberate circle, sitting down almost simultaneously, their eyes fixed on the old farmer with an expression that had nothing to do with aggression and everything to do with something far more complicated. One of them, a younger dog named Scout, pressed his head gently against Earl's knee and let out a low, mournful whine that carried clearly across the suddenly silent fairground. Roy Calhoun and his diner friends stood frozen, their earlier laughter dying instantly in their throats. The crowd that had been chuckling at the strange old hermit moments earlier now stared in stunned, confused silence, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. Captain Render pushed through the crowd, her heart hammering, her training screaming at her that something was deeply, fundamentally wrong, though she couldn't yet say what. "Sir," she called out, raising both hands as she approached slowly, the way she had been trained to approach any unpredictable situation. "Sir, please don't move. I need you to stay calm." Earl looked up at her, his weathered face unreadable, his pale blue eyes carrying something that looked almost like exhaustion, the exhaustion of a man who has spent decades preparing for a moment he always knew, somewhere deep down, might eventually arrive. "I'm not going anywhere," Earl said quietly. "These dogs aren't hurting me." Captain Render studied the scene in front of her. 7 highly trained military working dogs surrounding an elderly farmer with a calm, almost reverent intensity she had genuinely never witnessed in 11 years of handling. This wasn't aggression. This wasn't confusion. This looked impossibly like recognition. "Sir," she said slowly, kneeling down a few feet away, careful not to disturb the dogs. "Have you ever worked with military dogs before?" Earl's jaw tightened. His hand drifted unconsciously to his chest pocket, where something small and hard pressed against his fingers through the worn fabric of his overalls. "A long time ago," he said finally. "Different lifetime, though." It was at that exact moment that one of the dogs, a powerful older shepherd named Bishop, who had been sitting closest to Earl's chair, suddenly lifted his head, opened his mouth, and dropped something small and metallic directly into the dirt at Earl's feet. Captain Render leaned down and picked it up before anyone else could. A dog tag the metal scratched and worn smooth in places, the chain broken decades ago, the engraved letters barely legible beneath years of tarnish. She read the name slowly, mouthing it once to herself before saying it aloud. Private First Class Daniel Ferris. The name meant absolutely nothing to anyone standing in that crowd. But Earl Hutchins's entire body went rigid the moment he heard it, his weathered face draining of color so quickly that Captain Render instinctively reached out to steady him. "Sir," she said carefully, "do you know this name?" Earl stared down at the dog tag in her hand, his lips trembling, his eyes filling with something that looked very much like 50 years of grief, finally cracking open in front of a crowd of complete strangers. "That dog shouldn't have had that," Earl whispered. "Nobody was supposed to have that. Not anymore." And with those words, the first mystery of that strange Tennessee afternoon was solved. 7 dogs had reacted to something about Earl that none of them could explain. But the second, much deeper mystery had only just begun. Why did an old soybean farmer in rural Tennessee carry a 50-year-old grief sharp enough to make him tremble at the sound of a stranger's name? And how exactly had a working military dog ended up carrying that exact soldier's dog tag in the first place? Captain Render's training told her to keep the scene controlled, but every instinct she had as a person told her something far more important was unfolding in front of her than simple procedure could account for. She gently guided her dogs back a respectful distance, though Bishop refused to move more than 3 feet from Earl's chair, lying down instead and resting his heavy head against the old farmer's boot. "Sir," she said gently, "I think we need to talk somewhere quieter. Would you be willing to come with me?" Earl nodded slowly, still clutching the dog tag in his trembling fist, and allowed Captain Render to help him to his feet. The crowd parted silently as they walked toward a quieter area near the fairground's administrative tent, Bishop trotting protectively at Earl's side the entire way, refusing every attempt by his own handler to call him back into formation. Roy Calhoun watched them go, his earlier mockery curdling into something closer to shame. Though he wouldn't have admitted it out loud to save his life, inside the tent, Captain Render offered Earl a folding chair and a bottle of water, watching him carefully as he sat, his hands still shaking slightly around the small metal tag. "Mr. Hutchins," she said, having gotten his name from a nearby fair volunteer, "I need to understand what just happened out there. My dogs don't react like that without reason, and that name on the tag, Daniel Ferris, it's not in any active database I have access to. That record's either sealed or it never existed in any system I can search." Earl was quiet for a long moment, staring down at the tag as though it might dissolve if he looked away. "It was sealed," he said finally, "on purpose. A long time ago." "Sir, were you in the military?" Earl's eyes lifted to meet hers, and something in his expression shifted, the careful blankness of 50 years beginning, almost imperceptibly, to crack. "I served," he said simply, briefly, a different kind of service than most people imagine when they hear that word. "Have you ever wondered what kind of secret could make a man hide from his entire community for 50 years? What kind of memory makes an old farmer flinch at a stranger's name? Let us know what you think Earl might be hiding, because the answer is far more painful and far more important than anyone in that fairground tent could have guessed." Captain Render made a few quiet phone calls over the following hour, reaching out to contacts at the regional base who had access to deeper historical records than anything available on her tablet. While she waited for callbacks, an elderly woman from the crowd, recognizing the commotion, approached the tent hesitantly. Her name was Mildred Combs, a longtime Millbrook resident in her 80s who had grown up not far from the Hutchins farm. I don't mean to intrude, she said carefully, but I couldn't help noticing the commotion. I've known Earl since we were children. Haven't seen him show that much emotion since, well, since his brother's funeral, I suppose. Captain Render's attention sharpened immediately. His brother? Mildred nodded slowly. Earl had an older brother. Walked into a recruiting office back in the late 60s, full of fire, wanting to serve his country the way their daddy had. Earl followed him in not long after, though he was barely old enough. She paused, her expression growing distant. Something happened over there. Something nobody in this town ever got a straight answer about. Earl's brother never came home, and Earl came home, but he was never quite the same man who left. Earl, sitting silently nearby, said nothing, but his hands had begun trembling more visibly, the dog tag pressed so tightly in his palm that his knuckles had turned white. What was his brother's name? Captain Render asked gently. Mildred's eyes softened with old sorrow. Daniel, she said quietly. Daniel Ferris. Half-brothers, different last names, same mother, closer than most full brothers I ever knew. The tent fell into a heavy, stunned silence. Captain Render looked down at the dog tag in her hand, then up at Earl, the pieces of an old, carefully buried tragedy beginning to take shape, though significant parts of the picture remained frustratingly, painfully incomplete. Mr. Hutchins, she said softly, what happened to your brother over there? Earl closed his eyes, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of 5 decades of silence finally beginning to break. There was an operation, he said slowly. One the history books don't talk about, because officially it never happened. 30 men went in. I wasn't supposed to be one of them, but our unit got reassigned at the last minute. He swallowed hard. It went wrong almost immediately. We were pinned down for nearly 18 hours. No extraction, no air support, cut off from everyone. Captain Render leaned forward, barely breathing. And your brother? Earl's jaw tightened, his voice dropping to barely a whisper. Danny didn't make it out with the rest of us. Not the way we did, anyway. If you've ever lost someone you still think about today, even after all these years, you already understand the weight Earl was carrying in that tent. Some griefs never fully heal, they simply learn to live quietly inside us, waiting for the right moment, the right memory, to surface again. Before Earl could say another word, Captain Render's phone rang. She stepped outside the tent briefly to take the call, her expression shifting from professional calm to genuine shock within seconds. When she returned, she was holding her tablet with hands that weren't entirely steady. Mr. Hutchins, she said carefully, I need to ask you something. And I need you to understand, I am not asking to cause you pain. I'm asking because 30 families have waited 50 years for answers nobody ever gave them. She turned the tablet toward him, revealing a heavily redacted military document, half the page blacked out, but a handful of names still visible at the bottom. This operation, the one you just described, it has a classification marker I have never seen released to a civilian inquiry before. There's a notation here about a single soldier credited with organizing an unauthorized extraction that saved the majority of the unit. She looked up slowly. Sir, was that you? The tent went completely silent. Outside, the fair continued, oblivious, carnival music drifting faintly through the canvas walls, but inside that small space, something enormous and long buried was finally beginning to surface. Earl's hand closed tighter around his brother's dog tag, and for the first time in 50 years, he allowed himself to say the words out loud to another living person. I got 29 men out of that valley, Earl said quietly, his voice breaking completely. I couldn't save my brother, but I made sure the other 29 made it home to their families. And then I came back here, and I never told a single soul, because every time I tried to talk about it, all I could see was Danny's face, and I couldn't bear to be thanked for a day that took my brother away from me. Captain Render felt her own eyes fill with tears she hadn't expected. Outside the tent, Bishop let out a long, low howl, as though the old shepherd somehow understood exactly what had just been confessed inside. Word moves quickly through a small town. And by the time Captain Render and Earl emerged from the administrative tent nearly an hour later, a significant portion of the fairground crowd had gathered nearby, drawn by whispers and rumors that something extraordinary had happened with the old Hutchins farmer and the military dogs. Roy Calhoun stood near the front of that crowd, his earlier mockery now replaced by a slow, dawning shame written plainly across his face. Mildred Combs stood close beside him, having quietly shared what she knew with several others while they waited. Captain Render guided Earl gently toward a small podium that had been used earlier for the demonstration announcements. Bishop, walking protectively at his side the entire way, refusing to leave his position even for a moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Captain Render announced, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent fairground. "I owe all of you, and especially this man, a long overdue explanation." She held up the worn dog tag for the crowd to see. This belonged to Private First Class Daniel Ferris, a soldier who served in an operation that, until about an hour ago, I genuinely believed had been lost entirely to classified history. She paused, glancing at Earl, who stood quietly beside her, his weathered face carrying a vulnerability the whole town had apparently never once seen. "The man standing beside me is Earl Hutchins. 50 years ago, as a young soldier barely out of his teens, he organized and led an unauthorized extraction that pulled 29 fellow soldiers out of an ambush that should have killed every single one of them." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Roy Calhoun's mouth fell open, his earlier jokes about a frightened old hermit suddenly feeling unbearably small in the weight of what he was hearing. 29 men, Captain Render continued, went home to their wives, their children, their parents, because of decisions this man made under fire at enormous personal risk. Decisions that have never once been publicly acknowledged because the operation itself was buried for reasons of military secrecy that frankly none of us in this field ever fully understand. Her voice softened. Mr. Hutchins lost his own brother that day, and he has spent 50 years living quietly, alone, carrying that grief without ever once asking anyone to recognize what he sacrificed. The crowd stood in stunned, heavy silence. Several older veterans scattered throughout the fairground, straightening instinctively, the way men trained for decades to stand at attention straighten without even thinking about it. An elderly man near the back of the crowd, leaning on a wooden cane, slowly made his way forward through the parting onlookers. His name, he announced in a voice thick with emotion, was Harold Tate, and he had been one of those 29 soldiers Earl pulled out of that valley 50 years earlier. "I've spent 50 years trying to find the man who carried me out on his back when I couldn't walk anymore," Harold said, his voice shaking, tears streaming openly down his weathered face. "Every reunion, every search, every letter to the Department of Defense, nothing. They told us the records were sealed. They told us the man who saved us had never officially existed." He stopped directly in front of Earl, his cane trembling in his grip. "I never stopped looking for you, son. 50 years, and I never stopped looking." Earl stared at Harold for a long, breathless moment, and something in his careful, guarded composure finally completely shattered. "Harold," he whispered, recognition flooding his face. "Harold Tate, you had a photograph of your daughter in your helmet. You kept talking about getting home to see her walk for the first time. Harold's legs nearly gave out beneath him. "She's 52 years old now," he said through tears. "She has grandchildren of her own. Because of you, Earl. Because you came back for us when nobody else could." The two old men embraced in the middle of that stunned, silent fairground, Bishop pressing himself gently against both their legs. As though the old shepherd somehow understood, he was witnessing the closing of a wound. 50 years in the making. Captain Render, struggling to maintain her composure, addressed the crowd once more. "I'd like to formally request, through proper military channels, that Mr. Hutchins' actions that day be reviewed for the recognition they were always owed." She turned to Earl directly. "Sir, on behalf of every service member standing in this crowd today, thank you. 50 years late, but thank you." What do you think kept Earl silent for 50 long years? Was it grief over his brother? Shame that he survived when Danny didn't? Or simply a quiet humility that never needed recognition to feel his sacrifice was worth it? Whatever the reason, you're about to see exactly how a small Tennessee town chose to make it right. In the weeks following that extraordinary afternoon at the Millbrook County Fair, word of Earl Hutchins's story spread far beyond the boundaries of the small town that had spent 50 years overlooking him. Local news picked up the story first, followed quickly by a regional outlet, and within a month, military officials from 3 different branches had reached out to formally review the sealed records of the operation. Earl had spoken about so reluctantly inside that fairground tent. The Department of Defense, after a review process that took several emotional weeks, confirmed what Captain Render had already suspected. Earl Hutchins, barely 20 years old at the time, had indeed organized and executed an unauthorized but extraordinarily effective extraction that saved 29 fellow soldiers during an operation that had been classified for reasons that, even decades later, remained only partially explained to the public. A formal ceremony was organized at the very same fairground where 7 military dogs had first broken formation, drawing a crowd nearly triple the size of the original demonstration. Veterans from 4 surrounding states made the journey to Millbrook, many of them men Earl had never personally met, but all of them understanding, in the way only fellow soldiers can, exactly what his 50 years of silence had cost him. Harold Tate stood near the front of that crowd, alongside several other survivors of the same operation, men now in their 70s, gathered together for the first time in decades, brought back into each other's lives by a story none of them had ever expected to hear told out loud again. Captain Render, dressed in formal uniform, stood beside a senior officer flown in specifically for the occasion, a decorated general who had personally reviewed Earl's records and insisted on presenting the recognition himself. "Earl Hutchins," the general announced, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed fairground. 50 years ago, you made a choice that most men twice your age and experience would have hesitated to make. You chose to go back into danger, alone, to bring your brothers home, even knowing the cost might be everything you had. He paused, his composure visibly affected by the weight of his own words. "Today, on behalf of a grateful nation that failed, for far too long, to properly honor your sacrifice, it is my privilege to present you with the recognition you have always deserved." The general pinned a medal to Earl's worn flannel shirt, the same careful precision Earl himself might have once used decades earlier, securing something far more meaningful than simple decorative metal. Bishop sat perfectly still throughout the entire ceremony, positioned directly beside Earl's feet, refusing to move even an inch, as though some quiet instinct told him exactly how much this moment mattered. Harold Tate stepped forward next, holding a small wooden box that trembled slightly in his weathered hands. "Earl," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "after the fair, I went home and tore my house apart looking for this. I want you to have it." He opened the box to reveal a folded American flag, carefully preserved, along with an old photograph showing a much younger Harold, standing beside a smiling young soldier in desert fatigues. "That's Danny," Harold said softly. "I kept this photo for 50 years because I never wanted to forget the brother who didn't come home with us, even though I never knew exactly how to find his family to give it back." Earl's hands shook as he accepted the photograph, staring down at his brother's smiling face for the first time in nearly 5 decades without flinching away from the memory. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for keeping him with you." The crowd, many of them wiping away tears they hadn't expected to shed at a county fair, watched in reverent silence as Earl carefully placed the photograph beside his brother's dog tag, finally, after 50 years, allowing himself to hold both pieces of his brother's memory together, in the open, in front of the very community that had once dismissed him as nothing more than a strange old hermit. Mildred Combs approached quietly afterward, resting a gentle hand on Earl's arm. 50 years, Earl," she said softly. 50 years living right down the road, and we never knew the man we had among us." Earl managed a small, tired smile, the first genuine smile many in that crowd had ever seen cross his face. "I didn't want anyone to know," he admitted quietly. "Telling the story meant living through that day again, and I wasn't sure I could survive it twice." "You don't have to carry it alone anymore," Mildred said gently. "Not now." Roy Calhoun, standing nearby, finally found the courage to approach, his expression carrying the unmistakable weight of genuine remorse. "Mr. Hutchins," he said quietly, extending his hand, "I said some things at the fair I deeply regret. I had no idea who you really were. I'm sorry, truly." Earl studied the younger man for a long moment before accepting his hand. "Most folks don't know the people they walk past every day," he said simply. "Doesn't make the apology any less appreciated, though." The ceremony closed with a formal salute from every uniformed service member present, dozens of hands raised in unison, honoring a quiet farmer who had spent 50 years believing his sacrifice would never be acknowledged. Bishop remained pressed against Earl's leg throughout the entire tribute, the old shepherd's calm, steady presence the only thing keeping Earl grounded, as decades of carefully buried grief and pride finally found their way into the open air. In the months that followed, Earl Hutchins's quiet farmhouse outside Millbrook stopped feeling quite so isolated. Harold Tate and several other survivors of that 50-year-old operation began visiting regularly, sitting on Earl's porch through long summer evenings, finally sharing stories about a mission none of them had been able to speak about for half a century. The county renamed a small stretch of road leading toward Earl's property, Hutchins Lane, a modest but permanent acknowledgement that the town had finally properly seen the man who had lived quietly among them for so long. Captain Render requested, and was eventually granted, special permission to bring Bishop back to visit Earl every few months, the old shepherd trotting eagerly up the gravel driveway each time, never once needing to be told where to find him. Earl began keeping a small bag of dog treats by his front door, a quiet, simple gesture that somehow meant more to him than nearly anything else that had happened since that strange and extraordinary afternoon at the county fair. On the 1-year anniversary of that fairground reunion, Earl walked out to the small family cemetery plot at the edge of his property, where a modest stone bearing his brother's name had stood quietly for nearly 50 years, visited only by Earl himself, late at night when nobody could see him grieving. This time, Bishop walked beside him, and, as Earl knelt down to place a small bouquet of wild flowers against the weathered stone, the old shepherd lay down gently beside the grave, resting his head across his paws, keeping silent. Faithful watch beside a soldier he had never known, but whose memory he somehow seemed to understand mattered more than words ever could. Earl rested his hand on Bishop's broad back, looking out across the soybean fields, stretching toward the horizon, 50 years of solitary grief, finally beginning, gently and slowly, to soften into something closer to peace. "You'd be proud of the men you saved, Danny," Earl whispered into the quiet Tennessee evening. "I made sure they all made it home. I just wish I could have brought you home too." The wind moved softly through the fields, and somewhere in that quiet moment, surrounded by the only family he had left, a loyal dog and the memory of a brother he had carried for 50 years, Earl Hutchins finally allowed himself to believe that some sacrifices, however long they wait, eventually find the recognition they deserve. Have you ever known someone who carried a private sorrow for decades, someone who never asked for thanks, never sought recognition, simply did what needed to be done, and quietly carried the cost alone? Maybe it was a father who never spoke about his service. Maybe it was a grandmother who lost a brother in a war nobody talks about anymore. Maybe it was someone in your own family whose story you never fully learned until it was almost too late to ask. Tell us about them in the comments below. Their story deserves to be remembered too. If this story touched your heart, consider leaving a like so more people can discover stories like this one. Stories about quiet courage, about sacrifices made without ever expecting thanks, and about the loyal animals who somehow always seem to know exactly who deserves to be honored. Here at Canine Heroes Uncovered, we share stories of loyalty, courage, and unforgettable bonds between the bravest dogs and the people who love them. If these stories mean something to you, please subscribe, because there are so many more waiting to be told. Share this story with someone who loves dogs, who loves veterans, or who simply believes that quiet sacrifice deserves to be seen. And tell us where you're watching from today. We always love hearing from this incredible community of yours. Because somewhere right now, in a small town, much like Millbrook, there is probably another Earl Hutchins, sitting quietly on a porch, carrying a story the world has never heard, waiting for someone or something to finally help that story find its way home.